Welcome, everyone. My name is Todd O'Hara. I'm the president and CEO of the Montana Chamber of Commerce, and this is the third installment of our series on data centers. And our intention here has been to try to provide an opportunity to provide some real facts. There's a lot of myths and there's a lot of disinformation that's flowing around out there around data centers. And it's a relatively new issue for us here in Montana. And I say it's relatively new in the sense that there are data centers already operating in Montana. We're just talking about data centers at a sort of a different sort of a scale and a different sort of a size. So it is relatively new. It's not unique to Montana. You know, every state across the country is now looking at this as an issue as we see the rapid growth in technology and artificial intelligence and how we see our economy evolving and changing. And so our intent here is to provide some factual sort of based information for folks to be able to gather up some of that information outside of a heated sort of public meeting where there's a lot of misinformation that's tossed around, and we can make decisions from there. And so today we are going to focus on the permitting side of data centers. And so we're pleased and honored to have Sonia Nowakowski, who is the director of Montana's Department of Environmental Quality, join us to walk through the regulatory regime for data centers. And I think what we'll see when we get through this sort of presentation is that while Montana is out west, we are not the Wild West, right? There is a permitting regime that is required for data centers, and it's going to be fairly robust. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia, Director Nowakowski, have her walk us through the permitting regime. And then when she's finished, we'll stop the recording and then we'll open it up to questions so that you can feel free to ask questions without being concerned about it being recorded. We will share the recorded version of this on our YouTube channel. We have shared and have the other two, data center pieces up on our website. You can check those out if you want to see those. One was on energy, the other one was on water. And so again, today we're going to focus on permitting. So thank you, Director Nowakowski, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Todd. I appreciate you all having me here this afternoon. Look forward to the discussion and the questions in the end. I think I'm going to come at this at a couple different ways. You can't read anything in the newspaper, in the news right now in Montana without also reading and hearing about data centers. And so with that in mind, I want to give you just kind of a brief introduction to the issue in Montana, kind of from DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality's role. And you might be wondering, why is DEQ here today, and when did they become experts on data centers? And it's a fair question. So I'm going to start there. And DEQ's involvement in this data center discussion is really from two distinct areas. And one is our role as the State Energy Office. Montana Department of Environmental Quality has housed the State Energy Office for the last 20 years, pretty much. We're one of 26 energy offices around the country. Our second role is as an environmental regulator. And so I'm going to talk about both of those roles this afternoon and how they fit into this data center discussion. It's well understood that the computing technology for data centers, including AI, large language models, cloud servers, cryptocurrency mining operations, that they require a lot of power to run and to cool those servers. But it's also important to note that data centers, as Todd mentioned, aren't entirely new to Montana. Private sector data centers plus a couple of state-run data centers have operated in Montana for a decade or more. And we've had crypto mining operations that have been active in the state for the last 5 years or so. What is new is the scale of operations and the potential energy demand to serve those operations, and the increasing investment in AI computing in particular. As you're well aware, this is an issue we're hearing about across the country. So on the energy context, the energy demand that we're seeing to power data centers is really emerging within a larger context that I think it's important for us to understand. And this is kind of where our energy office fits into this discussion. We're very involved in regional discussions and participate in regional activities. So regionally, there are 4 big trends that I think can help us focus this discussion this afternoon. The first is that across the West, We're seeing surging energy demand that's driven by data center development, but it's also driven by manufacturing, a continuously growing population, and electrification of everything from heating loads to transportation. Next, in recent years, there's been strong growth in wind, solar, and some storage assets, but that's also coincided with the retirements of a lot of dispatchable thermal generation. So, the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, which monitors electricity system reliability across the electrical grid, is sounding the alarm over concerns with resource adequacy. In other words, they're talking about the risk of some potential outages due to this changing mix in energy resources, where we have growing demand and increasing frequency of extreme weather events, and at the same time, where we have wind and solar growing in number, but we have some of this dispatchable base load power going down. The final point is that I think we all know energy prices are up, primarily driven by the costs to replace aging infrastructure and to reliably serve energy demand. So those regional trends are very much alive in Montana, and they absolutely inform the discussion around data center development. So here in Montana, the Northwestern Energy Balancing Authority is responsible for matching real-time energy supply with energy demand, and that's across all of its residential and commercial customers, as well as many of the rural electric cooperatives in the state, and also most of the large industrial customers. In Montana, large industrial or choice customers, they take transmission service from Northwestern, but often they enter into supply contracts on the open market, and that's outside of Northwestern's regulated rate-based energy supply service. So I think some examples of those choice customers, Stillwater Mine, Montana Resources, GCC Trident, the refineries. So it's important to keep that in mind. But the Balancing Authority covers about 2/3 of the state's energy load, and that 24/7 operation in Butte monitors transmission flows, outages, and fluctuations in both generation and energy demand, make sure that we keep the lights on. So for example, during that cold snap in January 2024, when temperatures hit, -30 in much of the state, the Northwestern Energy Balancing Authority, they hit a new peak demand of 2,175 megawatts. The Northwestern's Balancing Authority also got close to breaking that record during a heat wave in July of 24. And that's the same heat wave that ended with a straight line windstorm with wind speeds that topped 100 miles per hour at the top of Missoula's Mount Sentinel and knocked out power to tens of thousands of utility customers. So this is all important, and the role of DEQ, the State Energy Office, also addresses all energy emergencies. So we're constantly looking at this balancing authority and this work that's happening behind the scenes that we all kind of take for granted. Our role is to inform the governor of these energy emergencies, and Northwestern Energy has been an absolutely wonderful partner in keeping us in the loop. But over the past 5 years, development in new energy generation has been active in the state, but we've also seen some trends emerging that mirror the situation. It's pretty common across the West. So, for example, we've brought on 1,300 megawatts of wind, but much of it serves to export markets. We've brought on 164 megawatts of solar, and we've brought on one 175 megawatt natural gas plant. In that same time period, 664 megawatts of coal, including Colstrip Units 1 and 2, and the Lewis and Clark Generating Station were retired. The final note that I'm going to add on in the energy context is that longtime owners in the Colstrip Power Plant, Puget Sound, Vista, as we know, are divesting some of their ownership and transferring their shares to Northwestern to meet some state policy requirements in Washington state. And Northwestern is picking up ownership, I think, of 590 megawatts, adding to its existing 220 megawatt share, and they'll have that majority ownership of the Colstrip plant. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I think you've talked a lot about this, but I also think it's important to kind of talk about what exactly is a data center. Because it's a really generic term that can cover a lot of different cases. And that can be, enterprise data centers that are owned and operated by a single business or government entity to support its own internal users and applications. And there's cloud data centers operated by an entity that's like, that would be like an Amazon Web Service that offers hosting for storage and computer services. And then there's the hyperscale data centers that support that massive computing workloads You hear this in that context of AI or the crypto mining operations. And it's important to keep that in perspective, especially when we talk about that energy demand. Data centers are also rated by their expected downtime. So with tier one data centers, they offer up to 29 hours of annual downtime, and tier four data centers delivering no more than 26 minutes of downtime each year. And so that reliability is achieved by locating in areas with reliable energy supply and redundancy provided by co-located backup generation and physically isolated computing and storage systems. So enter Montana, and that is why we're hearing a lot about this. Secure data storage and computing operations also require that redundancy across a diverse geographic area to further mitigate any risk of outage. And so, as I mentioned earlier, and I shared with Sheridan a handout that DEQ has developed to kind of address some of these data center issues. And on there, we talk about kind of some of the development we've already seen of data centers across the state, excuse me, across the state, including some truly a little bit Wild West scenarios. And it's worth noting that the use cases of these operations are often closely held trade secrets. So it's really sometimes difficult to get a full picture of how that data center is being used. And I think that's also really kind of flavored the discussion. But we have Atlas Power, which has about 75 megawatts of computing power online in Butte. I think that was supplied by Portland General Electric share in Colstrip. There's Beowulf Energy with about 100 megawatts of crypto mining load online in Hardin. They take direct supply from the Hardin coal-fired power plant. There's VisionNet, Parsec, Opticom, and SITSD, the state of Montana. They all operate data centers in Bozeman, Missoula, Billings, Helena, and Miles City. They probably draw less than 5 megawatts. I think notably the locations of the state's data centers in Helena and Miles City really take advantage of Montana's geographic diversity. Miles City is in that eastern interconnect, which is an entirely separate grid than the western interconnect, which serves the western two-thirds of the state and most of the western states. There are at least 9 operational crypto mining operations sited at oil well pads across eastern Montana. And those are powered mostly by on-site engines fueled with gas from those well operations that would otherwise be flared on site. When I checked all together, our Air Quality Bureau has permitted 13 of these sites, totaling about 165 megawatts of generating capacity. And these are modular generators that can be loaded up and moved to other sites when a well is depleted. As I mentioned, what's hit the news in recent months are these much, much bigger announcements like Atlas Power and expanding in Butte and adding more megawatts of energy load. Sabey Data Centers has announced some intentions to build a data center up to, I think we've heard 250 megawatts of power. Beowulf has talked about 300 megawatts of data load center in Hardin. Quantica, another one where we've heard some numbers in Yellowstone County up to and around 1,000 megawatts. These recent announcements have also really kind of demonstrated the volatility of this industry, I think. Ardent TAC Data Centers, for example, announced that it was going to build a data center in Great Falls. I think they had said about 600 megawatts of power, but they later withdrew that plan, citing some delays in kind of development of transmission service. So I think that's also feeding into this public perception about what's really happening is just how volatile this is right now. Because if we were to take this all together, there have been announcements of about 2,000 megawatts or 2 gigawatts of new data center projects in Montana. In other words, if all of the computing capacity were built, it would double the peak energy load of Northwestern Energy's Balancing Authority that we set back, as I mentioned, in January 2024 during that cold snap, or in July 24 during that heat wave. And so I'm not in a position to judge which of these are the most viable of projects, but I think we are seeing, more agreements or announcements of agreements with Northwestern Energy, and that's also starting to help us paint the picture. Current law limits Northwestern's ability to serve new customers larger than 5 megawatts without first going to the Public Service Commission, which, as we know, regulates utility rates, and it requires a determination from the PSC that the provision of electricity supply service won't adversely impact the public utilities or other customers over the long term. And so we've seen that large customer load tariff filed before the Public Service Commission. I think we're all looking forward to an expedited review of that and getting a better understanding of how new large customers could potentially be served by a regulated utility in Montana. And this is really going to set the terms and the details of how the costs to serve these customers are covered. And that's going to include, what would happen to supply assets, how the cost of infrastructure would be covered, let's say in the event some of these companies didn't stick around. So it's a really big step forward, and I really look forward to seeing it move forward. And I'm hoping this isn't something that languishes at the Public Service Commission in a political quagmire. So with that, I'm going to wrap up that front on the energy aspect and switch gears to regulatory responsibilities under that environmental umbrella. DEQ's responsibilities related to data centers break out across a few different areas, and that's why we've developed that handout that Sheridan has. We get questions daily about people reading these stories in the news and saying, how come they're building this data center and I didn't know anything about it? I'm constantly reminding folks that we have a very robust regulatory system in place, that as these move forward, they are going to require permits, and those permits are going to trigger public participation requirements and public involvement. That we are having kind of pre-application meetings. We've had a few with some of the different data centers have come in to start talking about what permits they need, but to date we don't have any applications in hand for these large sites. But to start, Air Quality Bureau is responsible for permitting gas or diesel generation at any of these sites. And that also potentially includes backup power supplies to ensure compliance with all air quality standards. That also will require significant modeling and analysis to get that air quality permit. And again, a very public process. Water quality would review proposals to discharge cooling water, although the source of any cooling water would be subject to also water right permits administered by DNRC. I think it's really important to note Montana's Water Use Act, which is administered by the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, serves as the legal framework governing how water is allocated and how it's managed in Montana. So I sometimes struggle with the concept that's out there that says these are going to drain the aquifer. We do have laws in place to address the water quantity usage. We also have significant laws in place to ensure water quality is protected. As I mentioned, the Energy Bureau is primarily a non-regulatory program. They don't permit new energy generation, but they do administer bonding and decommissioning requirements for certain large wind and solar facilities. Our role related to this issue is primarily in kind of an energy planning function as well. We review and provide comments on integrated resource plans submitted to the Public Service Commission by either Northwestern or MDU. We serve on resource planning advisory committees for both large utilities. We also have the authority to intervene in some of these cases, like the tariff, before the Public Service Commission if we so choose. I think it's also important to note we're staffing the governor's recently launched Energy Task Force, which is wrestling with this issue among other topics. I serve as the chair of that task force. And so that leads me to my last couple points. I think Governor Greg Gianforte in September launched this task force with the idea to provide recommendations and strategies for Montana to deliver affordable, dependable energy for Montana families and businesses ready to invest in our state. And this is with an all of the above approach to energy development. The task force first met in September. Some of the top line objectives for the task force have included increasing the supply of affordable and reliable energy options, and second, developing strategies that not only address our current needs, but also ensure sustainability for future generations. And those strategies and what we're seeing is the development of some recommendations that really are a mix of executive branch and legislative recommendations. And we recently wrapped up a series of open houses where we went to Miles City, Colstrip, and Butte to talk about the task force and what it was working on, and also to take feedback from the public. And those were really great conversations. I think we had an opportunity to also say this isn't just a conversation about data centers, but data centers are part of that as we ensure we have a supply of affordable and reliable energy options. Membership on the task force covers a real wide range of different perspectives and expertise. We've got state legislators, representative of Montana utilities, electric co-ops, Talon, Berkshire, NextEra, independent power producers, a former vice chair of the Montana Public Service Commission. We've got data center developers, we've got existing large customers, and we've got transmission developers. Like I said, Bill, the data center topic is really top of mind, but across the board, we're hearing demand for access to long-term, affordable, and reliable energy supply options, whether that's to power existing mining operations, high-tech manufacturing, refineries, new loads, or just our homes. And so the broad perspectives represented on that task force, they have the potential to really identify solutions to this affordability, reliability, sustainability conundrum and to also accelerate deployment of energy resources, including transmission, geothermal, combinations of flexible load and energy efficiency. Everything's on the table. We just need to create more headroom in the system. And that can include energy storage matched with renewables. That can include natural gas and even nuclear. So everything's on the table. And the task force meets again May 20th, where they will be zeroing in on some of their recommendations. They've had some really robust discussions, I will say, about 698201 MCA, which is what deals with how large customers are served in Montana and the role of the Public Service Commission. I think they're going to come out with some recommendations on some potential modifications to that law. They've had lots of good discussions about transmission and better involvement in regional transmission organizations, better organization of our energy functions at the executive level. And of course, they've also talked on the tax topic to some degree and also about some of the tax incentives that are in place. So really good discussion, and we'll have our final report out in September. I look forward to sharing that draft report this summer and draft recommendations and getting some feedback and moving forward from there. But happy to try to answer any questions, and thanks for letting me blabber on. Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Sonia. That was really good. I mean, as far as a presentation on permitting, I thought you knocked it out of the park, right? These are the sort of issues that aren't exactly the most riveting sort of presentations, but I think you did a great job of kind of laying out a pretty rigorous sort of permitting regime in Montana. One of the things that kind of strikes me as we talk about data centers, and particularly when you talk about the energy usage that they have, is that it feels like in Montana that like we're kind of talking about this issue from a position of scarcity, and that we're not wanting data centers to come into Montana because we've only got so much electricity generation and we don't want it to go towards data centers. But really, the way we ought to be talking about this is in terms of economic development as a whole. Right? Do we want to, as a state, put a cap on the number of businesses coming into Montana or the number of residents coming into Montana? Because at the end of the day, electricity generation and supply is just that, whether you're talking about it going for data centers or new businesses or new investment in the state. That really is a big root of our challenge that I think in this state is the amount of electricity supply we have for a growing demand, even setting aside data centers. The demand growth continues not only in Montana, but in the region as a whole. So I thought you really did a nice job of laying out kind of this electricity generation issue as part of this conversation and part of the discussion that goes around data centers. And so with that, we'll stop the recording.